you shouldn't beat yourself up about it, because I think one thing that particularly goes through my mind when I'm having a meltdown or after, or having a shutdown and I'm going to selectively mute in those circumstances, that I have control over myself. Like I can somewhat tie together some thoughts. Sometimes it feels like I can do something about this and I'm choosing to be this way. But every time that I've had those thoughts and I've tried to convince myself that I can, it hasn't worked. It just doesn't work. So you may have those thoughts while going through a meltdown or after a meltdown, like you could have, like this was a conscious thing that you wanted to do. But try your best to disregard that feeling, that thought. Because in a lot of cases, it is not your fault. You haven't done it on purpose. It's not a fun thing. It's not a pleasant thing. You wouldn't want to put yourself in that situation. It's not fun. Purple Ella. What exactly is an autistic meltdown? It's a pretty short video, but I think it would be interesting to see what Purple Ella has to say. I have interviewed them on a previous podcast if you want to go check that one out. But yeah, definitely something worthwhile to watch, because I have seen some content creators get a bit confused about like the terminology and the differences between specifically around autistic meltdowns and shutdowns. I haven't really heard people talk about much the difference between meltdowns and panic attacks. It's something that I've covered quite a bit, so I'll be interested to see if this is representative, or I feel it's accurate to my experience. Right, let's get into it, guys.
So many of you might be wondering, what is an autistic meltdown? We use the word meltdown a lot to describe all different kinds of loss of control. For example, a young child having a temper tantrum, or any kind of loss of control in an adult. I want to talk about autistic meltdowns, which are specific events which happen to autistic people of any age. They are an intense response to overwhelming circumstances, causing a complete loss of behavioural control. I'm often asked, what's the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown? So let's start there.
I've heard it used in a lot of different circumstances like that. Like people generally say when they are struggling or feeling overwhelmed, they're somewhat dysregulated and they somewhat lose the ability to think clearly, and they're perhaps quite emotional that they are having a meltdown. Or you might have heard people use it in the phrase of, I'm going to have a meltdown about this. I had an absolute meltdown. You hear a lot of people talking about that specifically, but the actual origins of the word, the terminology that, you know, sort of brought this idea of a meltdown into the mainstream was actually, you know, due to autistic meltdowns. It's not really something that autistic people experience. You may experience panic attacks as an autistic individual and perhaps might get quite overwhelmed, but the actual experience of going through a meltdown is very, very different. Cherries Jubilee says, my not noticing that I'm getting emotional makes it feel like I go from 0 to 100. That's the old alexithymia. I think it's a really important thing to mention. I do talk about alexithymia quite a bit, but if you are struggling in terms of controlling meltdowns and in terms of managing it, I highly recommend looking into this idea of autistic alexithymia. I do have some podcasts and I do have some videos and posts which go into exactly what that is and what it can look like. But in general, it is a difficulty noticing and identifying your feelings in the context of meltdowns, or even in the context of general overwhelm and panic, because we have sort of a dulled sense of like noticing our emotions. It can often take a lot more of an intense emotion for us to notice it. So quite often, perhaps we might only realize that we're anxious when we get like 60, 70, 80% of the way to a meltdown. And by that time, most people would be able to say, oh, okay, like I'm getting a bit overwhelmed and anxious. I need to like take a break from what I'm doing, or I need to step outside. I need to regulate in some way. I need to calm down. Whereas for us, it can be sometimes quite hard to notice it up until the point where we kind of reach the crossroads of perhaps getting into that very overstimulated, kind of dysregulated state, which we do call meltdown. There are ways that you can learn to be a bit more cognizant of it. You can look at like physical signs You can try and characterize sort of different sort of ways that you might change in terms of thinking, the ways that you might behave outwardly. Being able to find different ways of understanding how you're feeling through sort of atypical kind of cognitive like understanding of your own experiences with anxiety is definitely like a really, really good thing when it comes to meltdown prevention. Because a lot of people, they might say, okay, here are some anxiety reducing strategies that you can use. You go to the doctor, go to a psychologist, and they're like, okay, do some deep breathing, or you can look around the room, you pick 2 things that you can see or 1 thing that you can touch and things of that nature. It's only really useful when you can be aware of how you're feeling. When you get to that point where you are approaching a meltdown, it's not like this switch that goes off and you just have a meltdown. It's a ramping up kind of effect. It is if you are on the way to having a meltdown, it can be exponentially more and more difficult in order to implement those strategies and think clearly when you're on that way. So I think that's definitely one big tip that I just want to say before we get into this.
An autistic meltdown is bigger, more emotional, longer lasting, and more difficult to manage than the average tantrum. An autistic meltdown doesn't have a purpose. Tantrums tend to be manipulative. A child learns that they can get their own way by crying, lying on the floor, and lashing out. This behaviour is then repeated when they want to get their own way, particularly if it has worked in the past. Autistic meltdowns are not manipulative. There is no goal. It is an intense sign of distress.
Yeah.
Tip: you can sometimes tell the difference by watching the behaviour. In a tantrum, you would see signs of the child looking to see what reaction they're getting from their behaviour and trying to negotiate to get their own way. The tantrum would end with them either getting their own way or realising that it's not going to help them to get.
I think that's a really, really good distinction, and that's probably how I would describe the differences too. I do want to highlight that it can sometimes be a result of something that's happened that they don't want as well. Like, it's like the actual initiation of it. If a child, I've worked in schools, if a child's not getting something that they want, it could be related to like routine and certainty and something in their head that they've decided that they're going to do, and it kind of changes and it causes them to be sort of dysregulated. But it can start off looking a little bit like that. But once it kind of moves into this idea of a meltdown, it doesn't really matter if you give them what they wanted in the first place, because it's kind of like it's set off. It's like it's triggered, and once it's like that, it's no longer sort of a defiance, or they don't necessarily have the ability to sue themselves when they get what they want, because it's not this kind of manipulative display as Purple Ella is talking about. They're not really trying to get anything out of the situation at that point. They are just in a very very overstimulated, like completely sort of dysregulated emotional state. So it's very, very different in that way. Every sound stacks as if it's a priority. You can't filter anything out. Yeah. I've had tantrums turn into meltdowns, 100%. Long bouts of people pleasing, masking, caused years of severe depressive episodes as an adult. I'm sorry to hear that, really. I mostly had autistic meltdowns start as an older child and adult. I thought it was kind of backwards. I have had a situation in my own life where, in teenagehood, from early childhood to teenagehood, I did have quite sort of consistent meltdowns, especially during teenagehood. But nowadays, it doesn't really transition from a shutdown into a meltdown very regularly. It only tends to happen when someone is causing it. So I have been in a very difficult, sort of unhealthy, sort of romantic relationship in the past where I have been somewhat triggered or forced into a meltdown because someone wouldn't stop asking me questions. Someone continued to be emotive even though I'd expressed that, I might have a meltdown because I'm feeling dysregulated. Sort of continued to do that. That's usually when when it tends to turn into a meltdown for me. You know, it's when it doesn't stop. It's when the shutdown no longer serves the purpose of cutting me off from the rest of the world, which is causing me to get into that state.
Get their own way. In a meltdown, the person will have no control over what they are doing, and they may look panicked or frightened. They may shut down or try to escape. They will lose their ability to problem solve or negotiate. The meltdown won't necessarily...
I don't know if, like... Because it is definitely very, very accurate to my experience, but I've heard other people sort of characterizing it as a somewhat loss of function, not necessarily a loss of all of your functionality, ability to communicate, etc. It really depends for me on the intensity of the meltdown, because I can have really, really intense ones, which, you know, come with a lot of, you know, uncontrollable, like, motor tics, non-ability to communicate, you know, pretty much what Pepper is describing, but sometimes it can be somewhat of a minor meltdown, not necessarily as intense, and I still have the ability to sort of say yes and no. I have the ability to somewhat be cooperative when it comes to people sort of leading me into a space which is a lot more quiet or a lot less dysregulating. I think it really depends on the person. Like, I can definitely make decisions and do things if I'm having a meltdown. It just takes an extraordinary amount of time for me to get to a point where I have an idea of what my thoughts are, and I'm able to execute things, and I'm able to process things. It's like everything's just slowed down to like a massive degree, and there is just this emotional wave of panic, you know. And I think it's worthwhile saying that it can look different from person to person. 100%. Like, for me, my meltdowns tend to be typically around anxiety. Some people might have them a lot where they express a lot of excitement, a lot of happiness. Some people might express a lot of anger. You know, perhaps being quite aggressive in some circumstances. That's not my experience, but I know of people who have sort of talked about their experience, particularly with that, for sure. I mainly shut down and stop responding. Well, the shutdown's is different to a meltdown. Like, some people characterize it as having an internal meltdown. I don't think that's necessarily the most accurate. You know, I see it more of it as a protective mechanism, not necessarily like an internal meltdown, because I don't tend to find them to be as horrible, overstimulating, difficult. My communication does go sometimes with shutdowns, but that's more of a compensatory thing, you know. It's to kind of stop me from becoming even more overstimulated. You know, kind of like a protective mechanism. That's my experience with it. People think my cataplexy is a shutdown. That's very interesting. What is... I imagine the cata element of that is like related to like catatonia, maybe. I'd love to know more about that, Cherries. I don't agree with the internal meltdown. Why do we think so much alike? I'm not sure.
Necessarily end when the trigger problem is resolved.
Yeah,
next, I want to talk about what causes autistic meltdowns. Meltdowns are caused by high levels of stress. They can be the result of sensory overload, an overwhelming situation, information overload, unexpected changes, or other challenges that person is dealing with, causing them to feel overwhelmed. In my experience, meltdowns are not the result of one single thing.
Yes.
They are usually triggered by a final straw after a series of challenges.
Yes.
To give you an example, I recently had a meltdown which looked like this. First, I was on holiday for the weekend, dealing with schedule changes, unusual activities and extra socialising. Next, I had been unwell the night before, so I was feeling tired and in pain and just generally a bit wobbly. I decided that the way to fix all this was to get a particular drink from a particular cafe. When we got to the planned cafe, it was shut. So, we went to a different cafe, and Mr. Purple went to get us some drinks. But when he came back, he hadn't gotten me the drink that I had asked for. I had a meltdown. On the surface, it looked like I had a meltdown over a frappuccino, but If you look more closely, I was in sensory overload and feeling physically unwell. The Frappuccino was just the final trigger.
And I don't necessarily think in this case, like, I think some people might interpret this story as like, this is like the final straw was a result of not like getting her own way, you know? Quite often when we feel stressed, like trying to assert some degree of certainty, in our heads about like how things are going to go, how things are going to happen, provides us a lot of relief in terms of anxiety. I have had situations in the past where Purple Ella was talking about overwhelm. I think meltdowns can happen from any overwhelming emotion. It could be anger. And I have had 1 or 2 times where I've had a happy meltdown, as I describe it. Getting way too overly excited and happy, particularly when I spend large amounts of time socializing with people, when I'm sort of in the social groove and I don't like take breaks because I'm enjoying interacting with people, I can get myself into a happy meltdown. Or if I get a really good piece of news, really, really good piece of positive news, that's happened to me as well. So it can be ignited by lots of different things. I do actually have, I think, a series of posts that I put out. So these are sort of the things that I've characterized as possible reasons for autistic meltdowns. Obviously, the social overload. That can be something where we sort of overreach our social battery. Illness and chronic pain can be an aspect. Lack of sensory accommodation, so sensory overload. General low mental health as well. So if you are having a particularly large sort of bout of anxiety, not necessarily due to anything, but just due to like your brain chemistry on any certain day. Routine changes is the big one. That's that kind of removal of certainty. Also sometimes related to dehydration or not having enough food. You know, sometimes we can neglect our body needs because some of us do struggle with interoception. Confrontation can be a really, really big trigger for a lot of people, including myself, especially with someone that I care about a lot. Burnout. If you're in like a long period of burnout, you can be a lot more sensitive to meltdowns. Very, very fast transitions from one thing to another that we don't have control over. That can be hard if we don't get that time to transition from one state of being or one activity to another. Hyper-focusing, or having a large amount of autistic inertia for a long time, very much eating into our energy supplies. Not knowing when to regulate, that's the aspects of alexithymia. Pressure to communicate, which is a really, really big one for me, particularly. Usually the thing that causes me to go from shutdown to meltdown, when I'm pressured to communicate and I can't. Sometimes related to rejection and failure. That can sometimes be a trigger for some people. A lot of small things to manage. So extending ourselves in terms of our capabilities, in terms of like executive function. Strong, overwhelming positive emotion. I've talked about that. Sometimes related to PDA demand triggers. So persistent drive for autonomy, pathological demand avoidance, forced out of hyperfocus too quickly. So if someone's not respecting our monotropic mind and our sort of focus on one particular task and sort of trying to force us out of that, it can be somewhat quite overwhelming. And unclear instructions, so not really having much clarity around something that we're supposed to do or things that we're doing. You know, obviously these can be, you know, triggers can also be anything really that causes someone to experience a high amount of anxiety. So it could just be non-autism related things, which definitely like contribute to that. And what Purple Ella was describing in terms of how they get into meltdown states. So there's usually like a string of events that happen. There is actually an actual like scientific reason for the reasons for this, and it can be the same for people holistic individuals experiencing panic attacks. And that is this idea of trigger stacking. And it's something that's primarily talked about in terms of animals, but it's related to this hormone that we secrete, which is related to anxiety, called cortisol. And cortisol is a very strange one because it's released when we are stressed, or we're needing to get ready for something, or waking up in the morning. But it doesn't just stay elevated for like a very small amount of time. Sometimes, well, in a lot of cases, it's elevated for quite a significant amount of time. So if you have lots of strings of things that happen for you during the day, you get a spike of cortisol, and perhaps you have another thing that happens maybe a couple of hours after or an hour after, it spikes again. And so it increasingly spikes over this period of time. And so there's a very, very small window of, sort of cortisol left before you get into a panic attack state or you have a meltdown. And it's usually that kind of end trigger that we're aware of, but we don't always look back in hindsight and realize just what kind of the string of events had led to in that way. Autisol. I get very angry, irrational, slamming things shut, throwing soft things, scratching and hitting myself. Screaming, shouting, crying. Yeah. I think that's something that that's how my meltdowns expressed when I was younger. I'm not saying that that's necessarily an immature thing. I'm just saying that that's what happened when I was younger. Nowadays, they tend to be a lot more internal and anxiety related. But I do have a lot of experience when it comes to sort of harmful stims, as you would say, sort of hitting yourself. It's something that does happen if I have a very sort of intense meltdown. Totally.
So, what does an autistic meltdown look like? Typically, but not always, you will see pre-meltdown signs of distress. This is a warning signal. This can look like increasing irritability and sensory distress, like hands over ears, increasing volume of voice, or restlessness. These warning signals could also include stimming, rocking, pacing, nail biting, and more. Just as autistic people are different, so their meltdowns are different. Not all.
I think as well, another good sign would be if we are hyperfixating on one particular aspect of how our day's going or what we want to do. That's usually a good sign. If we just can't let things go and we're continuing to sort of have a loop of thoughts around one particular thing that's going to provide us certainty, I think that that's also a really good thing. So, good example for me, when I was making my documentary, I had quite a few meltdowns because my computer wasn't working, and I'd said to myself, I was going to get this far with the editing today. And because I didn't, I stayed up very, very late, and I fixated on it even though I couldn't do anything because my computer wasn't working properly. So having that kind of state of cycling through of, so obsessively sort of trying to get something finished or focusing on a result or something that needs to happen can also be sort of a sign in my books. Meltdowns are a result of deficient emotional regulation and may occur with anyone with deficient executive functioning, such as autism and ADHD. I think it definitely looks different in autistic people in my experience, but I wouldn't necessarily say that autistic people struggle with emotional regulation, because we're pretty good at it when it comes to stimming, when it comes to that. It's just quite often the alexithymia before that. And sometimes the amount of stress that we experience is somewhat amplified because, as I was talking about cortisol before, we also do have a higher sensitivity to it. We usually release more of it, and it usually sticks around in our system a lot more than most people. I rock and stim when I'm feeling happy, but when I am like that, I usually sing too. Oh, that is cool. It's cool.
All meltdowns look the same. They might involve lying on the floor, hiding, running away, crying, shouting, swearing, throwing things, hitting themselves, or lashing out. Side note, I once threw an entire fruit bowl's worth of apples at a wall when I was in meltdown. Awkward. My meltdowns usually start with an increase in irritability and circular thinking. That means saying the same things over and over again. When I melt down, I usually cry and sit down or lie on the floor. I may appear angry and irrational, and I might shout. As I said, I have also been known to throw things. Like autistic people, autistic meltdowns will vary from person to person. Now you're probably asking, how do I prevent meltdowns? So I'm going to break that into two parts: short-term and long-term meltdown prevention. Long-term meltdown prevention is about living a life that day in, day out suits our neurology. This could include things like meeting our sensory needs, avoiding sensory overload, learning to recognise and manage our emotions, routines, time spent doing our special interests, appropriate support built into our lives, making and managing boundaries, energy accounting, and more. I've made videos on many of these topics, and I'll leave a link to anything relevant in the description box.
100%. Yeah. Really, really good sort of long-term ways of doing it. I would say the same. I would say as well, on top of that, perhaps having some semblance of an outlet is quite helpful, or it has been for me. I'm not necessarily saying go to the gym, but for me, sport and exercise has been quite a consistent sort of regulating thing for me that goes beyond like it being an interest of mine. I have heard it as well from my interview with like Temple Grandin at one point. I think she was talking about how like her body weight sort of exercise routine that she does in the evenings. That can be a good way. There's a lot of good sort of hormones, neurotransmitters that are endorphins even that are released when we do sort of have that exertion. So that could be something to consider. You don't necessarily have to do sport or exercise, but having some form of emotional outlet can be quite good long term, just as sort of a built-in thing that you have in your life. Like I tend to find that my anxiety tends to be a bit better when I am consistently doing that. As well as I was saying before about the Alexify Me, I won't go on about it again, but I think that's a really, really good way of learning to manage anxiety when, in sort of like the long term. If you can manage to cognitively kind of understand your own signs of any particular emotion that you might be feeling and have that sort of built in, and perhaps having a routine of sort of checking in with yourself certain times, that can be really, really helpful when it comes to situations that are outside of this kind of controlled daily routine. So if you're wanting to go out and do something new, if you're wanting to go to somewhere new, if you're going into a new situation or environment, I think having that in place can be very, very important. Being able to like sort of adjust sort of on the spot.
Next is short-term meltdown prevention. So what can I do to prevent a meltdown when I see warning signs that one might be about to happen? First of all, to say there is a short window of time from when you receive your meltdown warning signs to having the meltdown where you could possibly do anything to prevent that meltdown. So if you try and don't succeed and the meltdown happens anyway, don't feel bad about it. It's not your fault. But these suggestions might help. Walk away. Get away from anything which is triggering you at this time. Find a quiet, low stimulation space to relax in. Do not try to fix whatever it is that is stressing you out. Close your eyes. Simply closing your eyes can reduce sensory input and help you to regulate. Get to know your meltdown warning signals, and this can help you to implement the following strategies. Use any stims or sensory products that you might find helpful for regulating. This might include stimming, rocking, weighted blankets, flapping, hidey holes, and stroking your pets. Take some deep breaths. Sometimes I find it helpful to breathe in for 4 and breathe out for 4 and concentrate on nothing but my breathing and my counting. Wait until you feel calmer and more regulated before trying to do anything else.
Yeah, really good suggestions again. These things are just general like anxiety sort of regulating things. As Purple Ella was talking about, there is kind of that very small window. So as much as you can, try and widen that window, I would say, is probably a really good thing to do. I think long term, if you can get things into your routine that generally reduce anxiety, you're probably going to be 90% of the way of mitigating meltdowns. It is pretty hard to, because you do get into that kind of pre-meltdown state, it can be really, really difficult to actually like break away from something that is causing you that stress, like the thing that you're wanting to fix. So it's not always going to work, and I'm not 100% at doing this either myself. It can be also trying to recognize times or things that you do where you are much more likely to have a meltdown, and putting things in place preemptively, like having regular breaks in like a social situation perhaps, or from a new place. Doing that kind of thing can be really good, because sometimes you can sort of get very concentrated on like a conversation, and you're not as aware because your focus is somewhere else. So having like check-ins with yourself, or having some breaks that you can have during those sort of out of routine things can be really helpful. Usually if I'm in a pre-meltdown state, I'll just lay on the floor. That tends to do a lot for me, and listen to music. As they were talking about before, in terms of functioning, like I can function to a certain degree, and usually the way that I can function is the things that I do on a very regular basis, pretty much all the time, which is using my phone. So sometimes I can actually text, even though I can't speak, if I'm in a very perhaps shut-downy situation where I can't really speak very well, or sort of do much. Sometimes if someone puts a phone in my hand, I can, like, to a certain degree. Like, usually there's a lot of spelling mistakes and it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I can. That is usually quite a good way for me to communicate. But anyway, what I was saying about coping mechanisms, playing a mindless game, listening to music, laying on the floor, that's usually what I do. That usually gets me to a good place. But sometimes it can just be way too much, especially if there's something that I'm trying to fix. Yeah. Especially if it's like time bound as well. Like I've got like a deadline or something. Really hit me a lot at university, very consistently.
The rest of the day, low pressure if possible.
Yeah.
And finally, what to do if you have a meltdown anyway. For those of you who are supporting an autistic person, here are my top 4 things to do to help an autistic person in meltdown. Number 1, clear the room. Help the autistic person to be somewhere alone and safe. Number 2, stop talking. This person's brain cannot handle any more input, and even supportive words can make this worse. Number 3, don't touch us. Again, this is more information for our overloaded senses to process, and will make things worse. And number 4, be there ready to support and reassure when the meltdown is over. And for autistic...
Yeah. I think this is important to recognize here that this is talking generally, and probably about strangers or people who don't really know the autistic person very well. If you find yourself, you're listening to this and you support like another autistic person in your life, and reassuring them during the meltdown helps them, and hugs do help, or pressure or physical touch does help them, don't stop doing it if it's something that helps them, It's very dependent on the person. There you go. I disagree with the no touching personally. I love a hard hug. Yeah. If you want to communicate, if you want to ask the autistic person something and you know them very well, perhaps think about different ways that they can communicate. Like one good way that helps me sort of communicate the affirmative or the opposite of that, yes or no's basically, is squeeze something, or like shake your head, or do any sort of physical movement, asking the question very, very slowly, not overloading with words, but asking the question and saying, squeeze my hand, squeeze my leg if you want me to do this, or something along those lines, because it is very variable time to time, and it may not always work, but it could be an option. if someone is in kind of maybe like a low intensity meltdown. A high intensity meltdowns is like no chance of communicating with me, but that can help a lot. Hugs are amazing, variety is good. Yeah, try different ways, you know. Same goes for shutdowns.
People, here are my top 4 things to do when the meltdown is over. Number 1, don't beat yourself up. You didn't choose or cause the meltdown, and you are okay. Number 2.
Yeah, I think this is talking about like aftercare. I have done a post on this before as well, talking about meltdown aftercare, and definitely really, really important. Even though Purple Ella is telling you this, and maybe I'll tell you this, and other people will tell you this, there is no reason to feel ashamed. Well, there is a reason, or else you wouldn't feel ashamed, but you shouldn't beat yourself up about it, because I think one thing that particularly goes through my mind when I'm having a meltdown or after, or having a shutdown and I'm going to selectively mute, in those circumstances, that I have control over myself. Like I can somewhat tie together some thoughts. Sometimes it feels like I can do something about this and I'm choosing to be this way. But every time that I've had those thoughts and I've tried to convince myself that I can, it hasn't worked. It just doesn't work. So you may have those thoughts while going through a meltdown or after a meltdown, like you could have, like this was a conscious thing that you wanted to do. But try your best to disregard that feeling, that thought. Because in a lot of cases, it is not your fault. You haven't done it on purpose. It's not a fun thing. It's not a pleasant thing. You wouldn't want to put yourself in that situation. It's not fun. So although you may feel those kind of feelings of shame and embarrassment, just remember that it's not something that you can control. And if you put yourself in a third party's shoes, perhaps with someone else who was going through this, or even someone who was going through like someone was having like a seizure or something, you wouldn't feel that way towards them. You'd be very concerned. You'd be very, empathic and sort of understanding about it. But you wouldn't feel badly towards them. Like it's not something that they've done purposefully. So make sure to keep that in mind, Make sure to keep that in mind. If you do want to learn more about my specific ways of aftercare, particularly for people around you, and also for yourself, I do have a post on that over on my Instagram.
Care for yourself very gently. Do what you need to do to feel okay. Number 3, get rest and avoid stress for the next couple of days to avoid repeat meltdowns.
100%.
And number 4, worth repeating, don't beat yourself up. You are perfect, you didn't cause this, and I think you're great. I hope you found this video about meltdowns helpful. If you have, I'd really appreciate you clicking the like button.
Very brilliant video, a lot of stuff. Definitely a lot that I would add, but I think Purple Ella does a really good job of distilling topics into very sort of digestible sort of short form. And even to be honest, like even though it was a particularly short video, there was a lot of really, really useful information and points that I would definitely say myself as well. I would be really, really careful after meltdowns, because you will find that perhaps your sensory sensitivity is higher than usual. You may also find that your social battery is a lot lower as well. So definitely taking that into consideration, use as many sensory supports as you need to use, and try and avoid stressful situations, try and avoid social events. If you have to cancel things, you have to cancel them. Or if you have to move things to like your home environment to socialize and you feel able to, good idea. All the stuff that we're talking about on how to prevent meltdowns, take that even more seriously over like the next day, next 2 days. It can change as well. It's not always the same over time. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, make sure to like, subscribe, and also go check out Purple Ella's video. Give that a like, subscribe, maybe drop a comment down, say that Thomas sent you. Maybe do another podcast with him.